Lights, camera, and action, and welcome back to Soundtrack Collector. I'm your host, Christopher Spencer, author of Film and Television Soundtracks, 1950 to 1979, A Critical History, published by McFarlane and Company. If you're as obsessed with movie music as I am, you're in the right place. This month, I'm doing a series that takes an in-depth look at science fiction soundtracks of the last 100 years. Last week, I posted episode 1 that charts the early years of science fiction cinema from the silent era through the 1950s. This episode is obviously about science fiction soundtracks of the 60s and 70s, a monumental period. Next week, we'll cover 80s and 90s, followed by 2000s to present, and eventually wrapping up with an episode devoted to SF soundtracks from TV shows. If you haven't already, you'd better subscribe. Ring that bell to stay up to speed. So, whether you're a science fiction fan who wants to know more about SF soundtracks or a soundtrack collector who wants to know what soundtracks to get, you'll find this month's slate of videos invaluable. So, let's go back to 1960, when Sci-Fi had moved away from the paranoia and alien invasions of the 50s to embark on a more open-minded journey into time and space. Bolstered by a promising space race, filmmakers turned to telling mostly upbeat adventure stories initially, about man journeying into strange worlds, sometimes into the human body itself, and through warps in time. Now, the scores for these films are often couched in the familiar style of Golden Age Hollywood, but frequently expand the musical palette to summon a brave new world inspired by modern classical music. Fittingly, we're starting with The Time Machine, the 1960 classic from George Pal, the same guy who brought us The War of the Worlds in the 1950s. Pal convinced the H.G. Wells heirs to let him adapt this story, and Russ Garcia's unforgettable score took it to the next level. Garcia blended English folk melodies for the Victorian setting with edgy, Stravinsky-inspired tension, and there's a haunting three-note Celesta theme every time time travel comes into play. He even got creative with sound effects, using percussionists to hit a musical saw, play with gongs, and more to bring the time machine to life. Now let's dive into the music of Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, the 1961 film scored by Paul Sawtelle and Burt Schefter. These two weren't new to adventure. They'd previously scored Irwin Allen's The Lost World a year before. For Voyage, they delivered a sweeping orchestral score that's romantic and enveloping, with gorgeous use of harp and piano. You can really hear the influence of Debussy's La Mer throughout. It's lush, dreamy, and evocative. But don't get too comfortable, because the mood shifts into tension and mystery on cues like raw nerves, the squid attacks, and lunatic action. Fun fact, the Debussy-inspired vibe also shows up in the movie's theme song, written by Russell Faith and sung by none other than co-star Frankie Avalon. It's the perfect mix of drama and melody for an underwater adventure. For a more conventional sci-fi movie, let's talk about Panic in Year Zero, the 1962 post-apocalyptic thriller scored by the versatile Les Baxter. Known for his lush tropical exotica and space-age pop, Baxter takes a sharp turn here, crafting a score that's all about tension and chaos. With urgent rhythms and brooding melodies, Baxter nails the film's atmosphere of uncertainty and survival. His music perfectly mirrors the movie's themes, capturing the fragility of civilization and the primal fight to endure. It's a striking departure for Baxter and a perfect fit for Ray Milland's gritty vision of the future. Now let's blast off with the score for First Men in the Moon, the 1964 H.G. Wells adaptation directed by Nathan Jurin. Composed by Laurie Johnson, this soundtrack is pure magic, perfectly complementing the film's fantastical adventure and Ray Harryhausen's iconic special effects. Johnson's music captures the sense of wonder and grandeur, shifting effortlessly between sweeping orchestral themes and tense, dramatic moments. From the impressionistic beauty of the love theme to the playful whimsy of other cues, the score adds so much depth. And when it's time for action, Johnson cranks up the drama with brassy, percussion-heavy textures that really pack a punch. It's a dynamic and adventurous score that's as imaginative as the journey from Earth to the moon itself. Okay, let's dig into the soundtrack for The Day of the Triffids, the 1963 apocalyptic sci-fi classic based on the book by John Wyndham. It's a unique collaboration between composers Ron Goodwin and Johnny Douglas, with Douglas actually contributing more music even though Goodwin got top billing. The score is a perfect mix of dramatic orchestral elements and suspenseful, eerie tones, amplifying the horror and sci-fi vibes. Strings and brass take center stage, building serious tension during those creepy encounters with the Triffids. While it might not be as iconic as other sci-fi scores of the era, it nails the film's unsettling atmosphere and has become a cult favorite for fans of vintage sci-fi. Definitely worth a listen. Let's talk about the soundtrack for Robinson Crusoe on Mars, a 1964 sci-fi gem with a score by Nathan Van Cleve that's nothing short of ingenious. Working with just 24 musicians and 2 electronic organs, Van Cleve crafted a soundscape that perfectly captures the desolation of Mars and the emotional depth of the story. Now, the music swings between foreboding and triumphant, reflecting the harsh Martian landscape and the main character's incredible resilience. Tracks like Martian Night and Lonely Lights really stand out, balancing themes of isolation and hope. The use of electronic organs adds a futuristic vibe, while the strings and brass bring heart to the story. Despite its modest budget, the score is celebrated as a key character in this one-man survival tale that predates Andy Weir's The Martian, solidifying its place as a standout in 60s sci-fi cinema. Now, let's take a look at the score for The Last Man on Earth, the 1964 sci-fi horror classic and the first of 2 adaptations of Richard Matheson's I Am Legend that we'll talk about in this episode. Composers Sawtelle and Schefter returned for this one, bringing the same eerie vibes they delivered on The Fly and The Return of the Fly. This time they leaned heavily into tension and otherworldly sounds. No romantic themes to be found here, just pure dread. One standout element, the chilling choir that sounds like a pack of vampire maniacs, perfectly capturing the film's unsettling atmosphere. As the precursor to Night of the Living Dead and a stepping stone to the Omega Man, the movie and its score set the stage for decades of apocalyptic horror. Next up is The Satan Bug from 1965, a germ warfare thriller with a killer score by Jerry Goldsmith, a composer you're going to hear a lot about in this episode. Inspired by the film's diabolical premise, Goldsmith created an angular, spidery theme with sharp staccato percussion that really gets under your skin. In many ways, the score feels like a warm-up for Goldsmith's iconic Planet of the Apes soundtrack. Both feature exotic, melodic motifs and layers of percussion, drawing inspiration from Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. You'll also notice Goldsmith's signature style, sparse arrangements with instruments talking to each other, and subtle electronic effects like eerie warbles and shimmery tones, adding to the tension. Not just a stepping stone in Goldsmith's sci-fi legacy, the Satan Bug is a nuanced and thoroughly entertaining score that stands on its own. Now let me tell you about one of the most unsettling movie soundtracks of the 1960s. Jerry Goldsmith, yet again, working his dark magic on John Frankenheimer's Seconds. And this really isn't your typical happy-go-lucky Hollywood score. Released in '66, this soundtrack is basically what having an existential crisis sounds like. Goldsmith mixes traditional orchestra with these weird experimental sounds that'll make your hair on the back of your neck stand up. But here's the brilliant part. They threw in these old-timey, feel-good tunes like That Old Black Magic during the party scenes, which honestly just makes everything even creepier. You know how some movies use happy music ironically? Well, Seconds walked so movies like Clockwork Orange could run. Now, when you pair Goldsmith's nerve-wracking score with James Wong Howe's twisted cinematography. You get something that feels like a fever dream in the best possible way. I mean, who needs sleep anyway? Now let's talk about Fantastic Voyage, the 1966 sci-fi classic that was way ahead of its time. Leonard Rosenman's score was just as cutting edge. For starters, the theme sound effects suite isn't your typical music. It's a mix of heartbeat tempos, clicking teletype machines, and synth pulses. Pure music concrete brilliance. Interestingly, Rosenman and the filmmaker decided not to use traditional music until the microsurgeons entered the patient's body in their tiny submarine. Once inside, the score shifts to a full orchestra with edgy atonal sounds that perfectly match the surreal journey through veins and organs. And here's the kicker. The music only becomes traditionally melodic once the mission is complete and the team exits the body. With its rumbling lower registers and skin-crawling high notes, Rosenman's work on Fantastic Voyage really set the tone for many of the sci-fi horror scores we hear today. It's a masterclass in tension and innovation. Let's talk about one of Bernard Herrmann's finest sci-fi scores, Fahrenheit 451 from 1966. This project came at a tough time for Herrmann. He'd just gone through a painful divorce, and Alfred Hitchcock had famously fired him from Torn Curtain for not delivering a trendy pop-style score. Enter Francois Truffaut, a Hitchcock admirer who hired Herrmann to score his adaptation of Ray Bradbury's dystopian classic Fahrenheit 451. Herrmann was drawn to the project thanks to his love of books and his admiration for Bradbury. He'd even scored a few Bradbury episodes for Hitchcock's TV series. Truffaut wanted music that felt clear and almost neoclassical, explaining that modern composers would give him 20th century sounds. But Herrmann would deliver music for the 21st century. The collaboration wasn't always smooth. Take the fire truck sequence. Herrmann's mechanical, repetitive music featuring xylophones, which Truffaut found too comical and wanted to remove. Herrmann refused, arguing that the xylophones added a childish quality, highlighting the absurdity of a society burning books. In the end, Truffaut thanked Herrmann for humanizing the film. The score is pure Herrmann. Mesmerizing harp, swirling strings, tense rhythms, and tinkling xylophones. Tracks like The Books capture the tension, while Valse Lente offers bittersweet romance and wonder. One of the most poignant moments comes as the protagonist secretly reads David Copperfield by the light of a TV, with Herrmann's lush strings underscoring his newfound passion for the written word. Fahrenheit 451 isn't just one of Herrmann's best non-Hitchcock scores, it's a masterpiece that elevates the film's emotional depth and its powerful message. Let's talk about the soundtrack for Quatermass and the Pit from 1967. Now, I mentioned this film, or this film's predecessor from the 50s in the last video, if you want to check that out. This is the third Quatermass movie, the third and final, I believe. This is a film that combines science fiction and horror in a truly unsettling way. Composed by Tristram Cary, the score is a perfect match for the film's eerie exploration of ancient alien influence and modern scientific discovery. Cary's innovative use of electronic elements was way ahead of its time, blending seamlessly with traditional orchestral compositions to build tension and drama. The soundtrack features standout tracks like Prelude, which sets the stage for atmospheric unease, and Apocalypse, a 14-minute centerpiece that captures the film's climactic terror. While the score wasn't released immediately with the film, it eventually became available in 1996 with the album Quatermass and the Pit, the film music of Tristram Cary, Volume 1, and is now accessible on streaming platforms. Cary's work remains a significant contribution to sci-fi film music, crafting an auditory experience that amplifies the film's chilling atmosphere. Next up is the ultimate 60s sci-fi fantasy, Barbarella from 1968. This sexy, psychedelic classic features an unforgettable soundtrack by the Bob Crew Generation Orchestra, with music and lyrics by Crew and Charles Fox and vocals by the Glitter House. Crew was brought in after French composer Michel Magnet's score was rejected, and it's hard to imagine anyone else delivering such a perfect mix of pop hooks, trippy rock production, and lush orchestration. Flanged and reverb-heavy effects blend seamlessly with the grandeur of cinematic pop, creating a soundscape that's as wild and otherworldly as the movie itself. If you're into 60s cinema of any kind, Barbarella is a must-have. When it comes to iconic 60s sci-fi, nothing really tops Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey from 1968. Let's talk about the soundtrack, because the story is just as fascinating as the film itself. Now, Kubrick originally hired Alex North, who had worked with him on Spartacus in 1960, to compose the score. But instead of using North's music, Kubrick decided to stick with the temp track, a placeholder soundtrack often used during editing of movies. Now, this temp track featured existing classical pieces by Johann Strauss, like the Blue Danube, or Richard Strauss's, also Sprach Zarathustra, or Aram Khachaturian's Gaian Ballet Suite, or Ligeti's eerie avant-garde compositions like Atmospheres and Lux Aeterna. Now, for North, Kubrick's decision was devastating, but he'd smartly included a clause in his contract to retain ownership of his music after 2 years. North later reworked parts of the score into other projects and even turned it into a symphony. His friend Jerry Goldsmith eventually recorded North's original score with the National Philharmonic Orchestra. It's an incredible listen on its own. That said, it's impossible to think of 2001 without its iconic music. Also, Sprach Zarathustra feels like it was made for the film's planetary alignments. The Blue Danube perfectly choreographs the elegance of space station docking. Ligeti's haunting Requiem and Atmospheres evoke the mystery of the monolith and the vastness of Jupiter and beyond. Now, these classical pieces were already famous, but 2001 fused them forever with its imagery. North's rejected score is still worth discovering. Tracks like Eat Meat and The Kill bring a raw, percussive energy reminiscent of Goldsmith's Planet of the Apes. And The Bluff carries a spooky vibe that really wouldn't feel out of place in Alien. But as incredible as North's work is, imagining 2001 with anything other than Kubrick's chosen soundtrack is really almost impossible. Kubrick's choice to stick with the temp track wasn't just bold, it became legendary, shaping the way we experience 2001 and influencing his approach to music in later films like Wendy Carlos's brilliant Beethoven adaptations in A Clockwork Orange. But more on that later. Let's talk about Jerry Goldsmith's score for The Illustrated Man in 1969, based on a Ray Bradbury classic. While the film itself is often seen as an interesting failure, even Bradbury admitted that the music was a real standout. The episodic nature of the movie gave Goldsmith room to show his stylistic range. The score shifts from melancholy and lyrical moments like the tuneful theme to the chillingly atonal pieces like Angry Child. Goldsmith, a self-described serial composer, was a master of atonality, but his music isn't cold. It's formal, haunting, and deeply atmospheric. Now, the electronic elements are subtle but striking. For instance, he used an echoplex on woodwinds to create a unique sound, and tracks like 21st Century House lean heavily on electronics, giving a taste of what Goldsmith would later perfect on Logan's Run. Even if the movie didn't fully hit the mark, Goldsmith's score is a fascinating multi-layered achievement that elevates the film and stands on its own as a work of art. Of course, we're not done with Goldsmith. The Planet of the Apes movie series from 1968 to 1974 isn't just a landmark in sci-fi cinema, it's also a treasure trove of bold experimental soundtracks. From Goldsmith's groundbreaking work on the original film to Leonard Rosenman's avant-garde contributions, each score brought something unique to this ambitious, if uneven, series. Goldsmith's Oscar-nominated score for the first film is a sci-fi classic and a must-have. using primitive instruments like a ram's horn and cueca, a Brazilian wind instrument, and lots of wood percussion. He created an abrasive alien soundscape. Tracks like The Haunt with rapid arpeggios and hooting horn blasts, and The Trial with ominous bells and doom-laden atmosphere are really unforgettable. Goldsmith's use of metal mixing bowls and eerie echoes on the searchers added even more texture, setting a high bar for the series. For the second film, Beneath the Planet of the Apes in 1970, Leonard Rosenman took over. While he retained Goldsmith's atonal style, Rosenman brought his own flavor with metallic sonorities, layered tonal colors, and a chilling avant-garde choir. One standout moment in this is his ironic use of the hymn All Things Bright and Beautiful as the mutants' apocalyptic anthem. Now, the soundtrack's original release even included a re-recorded jazz-funk version with rock instrumentation, making it one of the most unique entries in the series' musical history. Goldsmith returned for the third film, Escape from the Planet of the Apes in 1971, adding funky bass lines and electric guitar to match the film's early 70s setting. While it's not as groundbreaking as his first score, it's fun and kind of fitting accompaniment to the Apes' time-traveling adventure. For the fourth film, Conquest of the Planet of the Apes in 1972, jazz legend Tom Scott stepped in. With limited time, he crafted a fragmented but imaginative score featuring prepared piano, custom-built instruments, and even acid blues rock. Now, tracks like Simeon Servant School mix jazz and circus vibes, while the unused free jazz piece Revolution is really a standout on the expanded soundtrack release. The fifth and final film of the original series, Battle for the Planet of the Apes in 1973, brought Rosenman back. His militaristic, brass-heavy score outshines the film itself, with tracks like March to the Dead City and Ape Has Killed Ape delivering intense, dirge-like atmospheres. While it's a strong effort, Rosenman's work on Beneath remains the highlight of his contributions to the series. Together, these scores really showcase a series unafraid of experimentation, from Goldsmith's primal percussive landscapes to Rosenman's avant-garde complexity to Tom Scott's jazz-infused innovation. The Planet of the Apes soundtracks remain a fascinating exploration of musical storytelling in sci-fi cinema. As you've noticed, we've segued into the 1970s, a decade of dystopias, at least until 1977. The early 70s were a fascinating time for sci-fi films and their soundtracks, with political scandals and an unpopular war in the backdrop. The genre shifted from optimistic space adventures to cautionary tales about dystopias, deadly viruses, and technology gone haywire. The music reflected this darker tone. Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange from 1971 epitomizes this shift. After redefining sci-fi soundtracks with 2001, Kubrick returned to classical music yet again, but with a twist, weaving works by Beethoven, Purcell, and Rossini into his vision for a dystopian future. Wendy Carlos gave these pieces a futuristic edge with her Moog synthesizers, creating unforgettable tracks like Time Steps and the Beethoveniana theme. Now, Carlos's work was so compelling it led to her own expanded soundtrack release, simply called Wendy Carlos's Clockwork Orange, which includes pieces left out of the film. It's a mesmerizing mix of classical tradition and electronic innovation that perfectly matches the satirical, violent tone of the movie, and really worth hunting down. Also in 1971, we have The Omega Man, another adaptation of Matheson's I Am Legend and Charlton Heston's third dystopian epic in as many years. Here he battles germ-infected mutants to a jazzy, rock-infused score by Ron Grainer. Best known for TV themes like Doctor Who, Grainer crafted a nuanced mix of pop hooks, experimental sounds, and cinematic atmosphere. Tracks like The Spirit Still Linger feature Emil Richards' eerie water chimes, while upbeat pieces like Surprise Party add a lighter, funky vibe. It's a stylish and eclectic soundtrack that's as memorable as the film itself. Also in 1971, we got the Andromeda Strain, based on the Michael Crichton thriller. Composer Gil Mel went full electronic, creating a chilling, atonal score that captured the alien threat of an extraterrestrial virus. Mel's pioneering use of electronic sounds made the music just as unsettling as the film's premise, solidifying its place as one of the era's most effective sci-fi scores. Even George Lucas got into the dystopian trend with THX 1138 in 1971, his debut feature. Lalo Schifrin, known for jazz-infused scores like Mission Impossible, stepped out of his comfort zone to deliver this experimental soundtrack. Tracks like First Escape and Second Escape are filled with eerie electronic atmospherics, while others balance out the bleakness with sort of Latin jazz, tribal percussion, and a plaintive love theme featuring alto, flute, and harp. Schifrin even incorporated Gregorian chant and liturgical Baroque music for a haunting, otherworldly vibe. Now, all of these soundtracks kind of reflect the creative experimentation that was going on at the time. Douglas Trumbull, the special effects genius behind 2001, made his directorial debut with Silent Running in 1972, a heartfelt environmental message film. Peter Schiavelli, the better known as PDQ Bach, composed the gentle pastoral score, complemented by 3 folk-inspired songs performed by Joan Baez. Tracks like Rejoice in the Sun lean into Baez's folk style, while the rest of the score balances acoustic simplicity with darker atonal passages on tracks like No Turning Back. It's a moving blend of folk, orchestral, and medieval-like accents perfectly suited to the film's tone. Another standout from 1972 is Solaris, Andrei Tarkovsky's introspective sci-fi masterpiece based on the novel by Stanislaw Lem. Eduard Artemyev's groundbreaking score blends synthesizers and acoustic instruments to reflect the film's themes of memory and consciousness. The electronic elements create an ethereal, otherworldly atmosphere, while the acoustic layers add emotional depth, bridging the cosmic with the deeply personal. Artemyev's work redefined sci-fi music, making it an integral part of the film's philosophical exploration. For something truly out there, there's Space is the Place from 1972, scored by Sun Ra and his Intergalactic Solar Orchestra. Sun Ra, a jazz innovator who claimed to hail from another planet, crafted a soundtrack of as eclectic as the film itself, which is kind of a mix of sci-fi, blaxploitation, and surrealism. Tracks like Calling Planet Earth feature wheezing brass, chanting vocals, and abstract moog riffs, inviting listeners to Outer Spaceways Incorporated. It's not your typical sci-fi score, but Sun Ra's cosmic jazz conjures otherworldly imagery more effectively than some more traditional soundtracks. Now let's talk about one of the more fascinating soundtrack choices of the 1970s, when George Roy Hill adopted Vonnegut's mind-bending Slaughterhouse-Five in 1972. He didn't go for the usual orchestral score or groovy 70s rock. Nope, he went full Bach, and not just any Bach performances, but the legendary Glenn Gould interpretations. So think about that. You've got this wild story about Billy Pilgrim, a guy becoming unstuck in time, bouncing between World War II Dresden and an alien zoo, all set to some of the most precise mathematical music ever written. Then you add Gould's famously eccentric piano style that gives the Bach pieces sort of an otherworldly quality that's perfect for this story about time travel. They even brought in heavy hitters like Rudolf Serkin and Pablo Casals before the Brandenburg Concerto. It's like they created this beautiful musical puzzle box that somehow makes perfect sense for a story about the chaos of existence. I mean, who else would think to score scenes of alien abduction with Goldberg variations? That's the kind of brilliant weirdness we just don't get enough of anymore. The soundtrack for Zardos from 1974 is as bizarre and unforgettable as the film itself. Composed by David Monroe, director of the early music Consort, the score blends medieval instruments with notch flutes, gem horns, and bells with analog synthesizers to reflect the film's strange, distant future setting. Monroe's work is both psychedelic and experimental, perfectly matching Zardos' hippie-inspired surreal narrative. The soundtrack also incorporates classical elements, including Beethoven's Haunting Symphony No. 7 in A, second movement, performed by the Royal Concertgebouw Orchestra. While there was no official release of the soundtrack when the film came out, it's come out since then, and it's quite an auditory experience, as unconventional as the film's visuals, distinct, daring, and undeniably as memorable as Sean Connery's crazy outfit. And then there's La Planète Sauvage, or better known as Fantastic Planet from 1973, a French-Czech animated classic with a hypnotic score by Alain Goraguer. Known for his work with Serge Gainsbourg, Goraguer created a funky psychedelic soundscape using a lean orchestra of Fender Rhodes, piano, flute, sax, guitars, bongos, and more. Tracks are haunting and hypnotic, blending wah-wah guitars with subtle electronics and vocal size to transport listeners to the surreal alien world of the film. It's one of the most creative and memorable sci-fi scores ever made. And it's worth mentioning that there are a whole lot of European sci-fi scores from the 60s and 70s that I could mention in this video if I had enough time. Probably worth doing its own kind of other episode just about European sci-fi cinema and TV shows. I'll be getting to that soon, I hope. Next up is Soylent Green from 1973, Charlton Heston's final dystopian epic of the era. Fred Myro's score, conducted by TV veteran Gerald Fried, is all over the map stylistically. It swings from eerie atonal orchestral cues to jazzy funk to even cheesy 50s style pop. The mix of hallucinatory, easy listening and pastoral moments makes for a really strange, compelling soundtrack that matches the film's unsettling tone. Now, let me tell you about one of the most DIY movie soundtracks ever made. Before John Carpenter became, John Carpenter, he was just a film student making this weird little sci-fi comedy called Dark Star in 1974. And of course, he didn't just direct it, he composed the music too, something he's done often. But calling it just music is kind of underselling it. This thing was a wild experiment combining actual songs, audio effects, dialogue, all mixed together into these two massive 25-minute tracks. There's this amazingly quirky country song called Benson, Arizona that bookends the film. Imagine writing a country ballad about a space trucker. Yeah, you get the picture. They even threw in Wipeout because, well, why not? The whole thing wasn't even properly released until 1980, and when it finally came out, it was this kind of beautiful mess of electronic experimentation and lo-fi charm that basically became the blueprint for Carpenter's legendary future soundtracks on Halloween. It's like listening to a genius filmmaker figure out his signature sound in real time. Talk about a cosmic jam session, right? Then there's Westworld from 1973. Yes, there was a movie before the HBO TV show where rich guests indulge in Wild West shootouts at a high-tech resort until the robots rebel. Fred Karlin's score mixes pastiche and drama with Wild West saloon cues, rubbing shoulders with abrasive violin sawing, electronic effects, and pounding piano arpeggios in action-packed tracks. Now, recorded in Karlin's home studio, the score kind of brilliantly captures the chaos of a fantasy world gone wrong. And he returned for the movie's sequel, Future World, in 1976, but this time left behind the pastiche elements in favor of a dramatic electroacoustic approach. Pulsating synths combined with forceful strings, brass, and rattling percussion in tracks like The Chase and Samurai Fight, delivering a more cohesive and intense soundtrack. In 1975, Rollerball came along, taking a different approach. The soundtrack features classical pieces by Bach, Shostakovich, and Tchaikovsky, among others. It also includes original compositions by Andrei Previn. Tracks like Glass Sculpture dive into chilling electronic sounds, while Executive Party bring funky, lounge-like vibes. The mix of groovy and classical feels a bit disjointed when you hear it out of context, but it reflects the tension between the film's dystopian themes and its slick corporate world. Now here's a wild bit of movie music history for you. The Man Who Fell to Earth, that trippy 1976 sci-fi film starring David Bowie, based on the Walter Tevis novel, had one of the most notoriously delayed soundtracks ever. I mean, picture this. You've got a movie starring one of the greatest musicians of all time, but he doesn't contribute a single note to the official soundtrack. Instead, you got John Phillips from the Mamas and the Papas teaming up with avant-garde composer Stomu Yamashita, creating this otherworldly score that nobody could actually buy for 40 years. That's right, this thing didn't get an official release until 2016. The real kicker, Bowie apparently recorded 6 tracks for the film, but they vanished into ether except for one that he transformed into Subterraneans for his album Low. 2 of Bowie's albums actually feature stills from the movie. So when it finally landed on Earth in 2016, fans discovered this beautiful mashup of original compositions, sound effects, and even some Roy Orbison and Bing Crosby thrown in for good measure, I guess. Sometimes the best things in life really do make you wait 4 decades. Also in 1976 is Logan's Run, another dystopian classic with a memorable score by Jerry Goldsmith. Inside the futuristic city, Goldsmith uses wild, gurgling, and squeaky synths to evoke the artificial, hedonistic world within. Outside the city, acoustic orchestration with strings and woodwinds take over, representing the natural world. The contrast is striking, and warm tracks like The Monument and the Love Theme really add moments of sweetness to a score that's otherwise dominated by brilliantly executed dissonance. Next up is Dino De Laurentiis' King Kong from 1976. It's a remake with one of John Barry's best action scores outside of his work in the James Bond series. While Max Steiner's original score for the 1933 classic was spectacular, Barry took a more romantic approach for the 1976 version. There are tracks that are very tender and melodically beautiful, emphasizing the emotional connection at the heart of the story, but it's really not all soft strings and romance. There are action cues that are equally impressive, that pulse with energy, featuring intense tribal percussion, soaring strings, and dramatic low brass. The tension peaks in tracks like Incomprehensible Captivity, which capture Kong's somber, tragic side. Meanwhile, other tracks transition seamlessly from lush romance to danger, highlighting Barry's mastery of mood. The only misstep? Well, there's a disco pop instrumental called Kong Hits the Big Apple, which feels hilariously out of place. Jerry Fielding's score for Demon Seed in 1977 dives headfirst into the avant-garde. Based on the unsettling story of a murderous sentient supercomputer, Fielding's music is as claustrophobic and dissonant as the film's premise. Collaborating with synthesizer player Ian Underwood of Frank Zappa fame and jazz guitarist Lee Ritenour, Fielding combines experimental electronics with an atonal orchestral approach. The result is a score that hovers in the trapped with a killer territory, using jagged sounds and unsettling tones to convey the terror of technology run amok. 1977 was a turning point for sci-fi cinema, with 2 groundbreaking films, Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind and George Lucas's Star Wars, not only redefining the genre, but also creating a blueprint for the modern event movie. A key part of their success, the unforgettable music of John Williams, who was solidifying his reputation as Hollywood's go-to blockbuster composer following the success of Jaws in 1975. For Close Encounters, Williams crafted a score that's magical and mysterious and just as evocative as his Jaws soundtrack, but with an entirely different tone. It captures humanity's longing for connection with the unknown through a blend of experimental atonality and sweeping romantic melodies. Unlike Star Wars, Close Encounters doesn't have a grand heroic theme. Instead, its most recognizable musical moment is a 5-note motif used for communication with the aliens, a simple but unforgettable hook. Tracks like Nocturnal Pursuit and The Abduction of Barry lean into suspense and dense atmospheric music, perfectly reflecting the film's mix of awe and unease. Then there's Star Wars, a score that revived the grandeur of the golden age of Hollywood with its massive orchestras, bold themes, and sweeping imagination. John Williams created a heroic title theme, of course, and several memorable leitmotifs that instantly became iconic. From the majestic throne room and end title to the thrilling action of Imperial Attack and the Last Battle, even the playful Cantina Band with its intergalactic ragtime jazz became a fan favorite. Now, while Star Wars may not be the most experimental sci-fi score by a long shot, its classical structure and larger-than-life sound made it an instant classic and fan favorite, ushering in a new era of crowd-pleasing movie music. Williams kept the hits coming with Superman in 1978, delivering one of the greatest superhero scores of all time. The soaring, patriotic main theme captures the essence of the Man of Steel, while the love theme is tender and romantic. Williams blends heroic fanfares with moments of mystery and drama, like the Fortress of Solitude, while action-packed tracks like Super Rescues and Chasing Rockets build excitement for the climactic finale. Even the villainous cues like Lex Luthor's Lair and March of the Villains have a sly comedic edge that match Gene Hackman's over-the-top performance. With Close Encounters, Star Wars, and Superman, Williams didn't just write music, he redefined what a blockbuster score could be. His ability to blend classical orchestration with emotional storytelling turned these films into unforgettable cinematic cultural experiences. Here's an unusual entry, Denny Zeitlin's Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1978. It's a fascinating blend of sci-fi and horror, leaning into atonality and electronic effects rather than the sweeping neo-golden age style popularized by John Williams. Zeitlin, a jazz pianist and psychiatrist, was initially expected to craft just a jazz score, but when the script shifted, he pivoted to an avant-garde orchestral approach with jazz highlights and electronic embellishments. The result, a chilling, discordant soundscape that perfectly mirrors the paranoia and dread at the heart of the film. Director Philip Kaufman praised Zeitlin's ability to channel his psychiatric experience into music, saying that it brought an eerie psychological depth to the score. Now, though Zeitlin earned critical acclaim for his work, the intense stress of creating it kind of led him to step away from film scoring entirely. It's a shame because Body Snatchers stands out as one of the most unsettling and memorable scores of its era. Meanwhile, Jerry Goldsmith was at the peak of his creative powers with Capricorn 1, a 1978 thriller about a faked manned mission to Mars. Goldsmith's score is sharp, percussive, and aggressive, setting the tone right from the dynamic theme. Yet he balances the intensity with moments of warmth, like the recurring melodic bedtime story theme, which adds an emotional center to the story. Tracks like The Message use ominous strings, low brass synthesizers to build suspense, while Breakout ramps up the tension with a nail-biting precision. Goldsmith's ability to create thrilling, high-stakes music while weaving in softer moments showcases his versatility and mastery. In 1979, Goldsmith kept going with Alien and Star Trek: The Motion Picture. Both are masterpieces in their own right, showcasing his incredible range as a composer. Ridley Scott's Alien is, of course, a dark, atmospheric space horror classic, and Goldsmith's score matches its haunting tone perfectly. But here's the twist. The music you hear in the movie isn't entirely what Goldsmith intended. The filmmaker had temp-tracked parts of the film using Goldsmith's own music from an earlier film called Freud from 1962, as well as other pieces, and they ended up using a mix of the original score, cues from Freud, and even music by other composers, Howard Hanson and Mozart. Goldsmith later admitted the score had been emasculated, with much of it not ending up where it was supposed to go. That said, the original soundtrack, which Goldsmith re-recorded with the National Philharmonic Orchestra, is stunning. It's starkly modernist, relying on strings, brass, woodwinds, and unique instruments like the serpent, didgeridoo, and log drums. Tracks like the echoing four-night time motif evoke the vast, lonely void of space, while a solo trumpet becomes a musical reflection of both the cosmos and Ripley's character. It's a score of primordial power, gorgeous, gripping, and deeply unsettling. If Alien represents the dark side of Goldsmith's genius, Star Trek the Motion Picture shows him at his most hopeful and adventurous. The score, which famously outshines the movie itself, is a grand, sweeping work that captures the spirit of exploration. Goldsmith's theme is rousing and iconic, so much so that it became the theme for the Star Trek Next Generation TV series. Other highlights include Klingon Battle, which brims with tension thanks to metallic stings and electronic flourishes, and Ilya's theme, a lush, romantic piece featuring soaring strings and piano. Other cues stand out for their eerie, mysterious representation of the alien invader. Goldsmith also used Craig Huxley's blaster beam to create futuristic soundscapes, an effect that became a staple in subsequent Star Trek scores. Considering Goldsmith's many SF scores from the 60s and 70s, I think it's fair to say that he's probably the most versatile SF composer of his era, Williams notwithstanding. Yet we weren't done with dystopias. Mad Max in 1979, a post-apocalyptic action film that launched a franchise and made Mel Gibson a star. Surprisingly, Australian composer Brian May, not to be confused with the Queen guitarist, chose a tense orchestral style instead of an abrasive electronic or rock score that you might expect. Tracks like Max the Hunter and Max Decides on Vengeance pulse with rhythmic energy, blending synthesizers and traditional instrumentation for a score that's both dynamic and cinematic. Then there's The Black Hole from 1979, Disney's ambitious space epic. While it's not among John Barry's most iconic works, it's still notable for being the first digitally recorded soundtrack. The heroic theme is serviceable, but lacks a strong central character to anchor it. Barry's signature style shines more in the darker dramatic cues, where the swirling violins and ominous brass evoke a sense of looming peril. Still, at times it feels more like Bond in space than a fresh sci-fi adventure. Next up, Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker from 1979, an adaptation of Roadside Picnic by the Strugatsky brothers, features an entirely different kind of score, composed by Edward Artemyev, who worked with Tarkovsky on Solaris. Inspired by Indian classical music, Artemyev layered synthesizers with flutes, the Iranian tar, and natural sounds to create an atmospheric soundscape. Using the semi-digital Synthi 100, Artemyev blurred the lines between electronic and organic elements, reflecting the film's meditative exploration of reality and the unknown. Classical pieces like Beethoven's Ande Freude and Ravel's Bolero are also woven into the soundtrack, adding to its unique, otherworldly character. Finally, time after time, 1979 closes out the decade with a nostalgic nod to the golden age of Hollywood. Nicholas Rosa, in one of his final scores, brings his legendary touch to the H.G. Wells meets Jack the Ripper time travel tale, with lush 19th century romanticism and thrilling action cues. Rose's music elevates the ripping yarn tone of the film. Director Nicholas Meyer described Rose's work as syrup on wheat cakes, perfectly capturing the mix of fantasy and reality. It's a fitting end to the sci-fi 70s, bringing the era full circle by embracing the neo-golden age style popularized by John Williams. All of the sci-fi soundtracks from the 60s and 70s are a testament to how diverse and innovative the genre had become as it was transitioning into the next era, the 80s, that we'll talk about in the next episode. So what are your favorite science fiction soundtracks of the 60s and 70s? I'm sure plenty of people will say Star Wars and Superman. They certainly were popular, but clearly this was a tremendously rich period for science fiction scoring. Leave your comments below. Really, I'd love to chat about it. And be sure to like, subscribe, ring the bell to get notified about the next episode, which will cover the 80s and 90s, a very cool period for science fiction soundtracks. Until next time, I encourage you to also check out my other channel, Speculative Reader, which covers science fiction reading. All right, till next time, keep listening.